Welcome to this Next25 public webinar. In the spirit of reconciliation, Next25 acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm Chloë Spackman, CEO of independent non-profit Think and Do Tank Next25. And today I'm joined by Dr. Laura MacLauchlan, Research Fellow and Project Manager at Next25. Laura has a really interesting role because she works jointly for Next25 and the University of Technology Sydney's Transdisciplinary School. So her role builds on an ongoing collaboration that Next25 has with the TD School, and she'll be stewarding the next steps of our collaboration on our constructive discussion work. So we're really grateful to have Laura. Today we're going to be exploring constructive discussion for democracy. So June 1 to 8 is the Australian Festival of Democracy and Human Rights. And this is a very important moment for democracy in Australia and, of course, around the world. At Next25, through our research and engagement, we know that for Australia to have the future its people want, we need to improve our ability to constructively discuss complex and contested issues. This is important for social cohesion, for restoring trust in government and in our institutions. And this is important for our democratic resilience at a time when democracy is on the decline and authoritarianism is gaining strength. But first, how did we get here? How did we get to constructive discussion, and why are we approaching the challenge in this way? Next25 is on a mission to ensure that Australia has what it takes to make the future its people want. And we do this through answering three key questions. What is the future Australia wants? Are we on track to that future? And if not, what are the deep contributing factors of Australia's underperformance and levers to shift them? And then we build initiatives based on the levers we've discovered through our research. Next25's Recoded research program uncovered 5 systemic levers or major opportunities to improve Australia's performance. These are a galvanising national identity, benchmarks beyond GDP, constructive discussion, engaged decision-making, and trust in government. And currently, the 2 areas where we're working on our initiatives in our Do Tank respond to the trust in government and constructive discussion levers. And unsurprisingly, the 2 are very interconnected. And so for this half hour, Laura and I are going to share a selection of key findings across many different streams of our work, teasing out key insights about constructive discussion, why it's critical, and how it can help us to create a resilient democracy. We also hope this will be an opportunity to inspire and connect with all of you for the upcoming phases of our work. There are so many different people and organisations and collective wisdom that have contributed to these findings, and we can't thank everyone, but we've made an attempt to name on this slide most of the key people in the work that we'll be referring to today, particularly from the past couple of years. A genuine thanks to each of you and those who are not listed, but were also a critical part of the journey here. This work is only possible through collaboration and the perspectives and expertise of many generous and inspiring people. When I say constructive discussion, I'm sure you all have ideas, your own ideas about what I mean. In Next25, we do have our own definitions as a result of our research and sense-making. But before we look at those, I want to make it a little more real for all of you. So I want you to think about a time, I want you to first think about some really hot button topics of conversation on important national issues. So the conversation about the referendum on the voice to Parliament, or the conversation about nuclear and the energy transition, or tax reform, or housing, or the cost of living. In the last 6 months or so, how many of you have been in a situation at work, at a barbecue, at an extended family gathering, where you felt really uncomfortable contributing to a conversation on one of these contested issues? With that instance in mind, I want you to note down somewhere What were 2 or 3 things that were going on in that conversation that led you to feeling uncomfortable? Why did you feel unable to contribute in the way that you would have liked to? And I had a little bit of a giggle thinking about myself in these scenarios, particularly as this is what I do for work. When I think about some of the dinner conversations with my family, I would say my go-to is pretty adversarial. I have 2 older brothers, and everyone in my immediate family is either a lawyer or in the military. And I would say that fiery debate is often the frame for those family discussions. Whereas if I think about what I'm like at some other social gatherings outside of my immediate family, if I suspect there's going to be a strong difference of opinion, I'm more likely to want to keep the peace and not make anyone feel uncomfortable. So just have a little think about one of those scenarios in your past and what hasn't worked for you in those conversations, and we will come back to that a little later. In this context, when we think about constructive discussion, we're really talking about the national conversation on issues of great importance to our collective future. But we're referring to all the levels at which that conversation takes place. So cultural, institutional, political, relational, and personal. When it comes to the reality of the modern society we live in, the echo chambers, identity politics, the social media dissonance, the influence of the social media algorithms, we're up against a lot of interconnecting and mutually reinforcing challenges. As I mentioned, our understanding of constructive discussion has been formed across a variety of work projects over the last 5 years, and these are listed on the slide. Today, I'm going to share some key takeaways from our Contested Spaces report into the key barriers and enabling factors that people in Australia encountered when discussing the then proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament, and from our work with women MPs in improving democracy, transforming Parliament for women. And then Laura will unpack our collaboration with UTS and explain what's coming next, as well as sharing some potentially uncomfortable questions we can all ask ourselves next time we head into a difficult conversation. So across these 5 years of work, 2 working definitions of constructive discussion have emerged. The first definition emphasizes pragmatism, describing constructive discussion as communication that is of useful and beneficial purpose, creating an environment where decision-making better reflects the shared view of the public interest with respect to the common good. This definition highlights the power of constructive discussion in effectively addressing societal challenges. Further work brought us to this second definition. So the second definition focuses on exploration and reflexivity, framing it as a communicative activity and process where people have the space and opportunity to share perspectives and explore difference in a reflexive, productive manner. This perspective prioritizes understanding and unpacking underlying values, beliefs, and norms over immediate decision-making. And our intention is that these complementary definitions allow us to be non-prescriptive, and they actually offer us a really useful springboard to explore what constructive discussion is and how it can be put into practice. So we may add to these definitions or adapt them as we continue with the work. When we completed our research into the quality of the national conversation in the lead up to the Voice referendum, a number of key themes emerged. Some of those key themes in the research included insufficient access to relevant information and concerns over its quality and reach, varying forms of perceived risk that impact people's ability to discuss issues and opinions, the need for safe spaces to discuss opinions, to avoid echo chambers and encourage exchange, and that public discourse has become performatively polarized, which involves this pattern of people across media and politics strategically leveraging conflict, and then this pattern of behavior actually filtering down into people's everyday conversations. Overall, we found that people face intersecting difficulties when they try to talk about complex and contested issues. And from the rich responses we got, we uncovered key patterns of meaning about the state of constructive discussion And this highlights some opportunities and places where we can concentrate on to do things better in the future. And up here on the slide are the barriers and enablers that our research participants encountered in trying to have those constructive discussions. As you can see, each is multifaceted and straddles intersecting ground. And there were more barriers identified than enablers, reflecting the reality that people's experience was, possibly unsurprisingly, overwhelmingly negative. So across the research, 5 key patterns of meaning really emerged. The first is that conversations feature low trust, bias, and disinformation. The media fuels and reflects. Social and emotional risk is powerful and contextual. Discomfort and confrontation are necessary, and there is conversational gatekeeping at play. And there are a lot of rich insights into each one of those patterns of meaning. We don't have time to delve into them today, but I encourage you to jump online and read our full report to learn more. So how do we address all of this? What needs to change and how can we do better? Overall, this research shows that consensus is not the focus of constructive discussion. Rather, constructive discussion involves the process of being heard and affording others time and safe spaces to express themselves. Our research highlights a lot of the prevalent issues and barriers, but it also shows us where there are opportunities for improvement. And these opportunities are a source of hope. You can see on the slide here the 4 areas of guidance that emerged through the research. However, as I discuss them today, I also wanted to make them a little bit less esoteric and share with you how we've applied these in a real life setting in our work with women MPs through Next25's program, Improving Democracy, Transforming Parliament for Women. And this is work we do in partnership with our incredible partners, Corporate Evolution. You would be hard pressed to think of a place that's more challenged by polarization and a lack of constructive discussion than politics. But that is a critical place for our work. Of course, we want robust debate in our parliaments and in our democracy, but we want it to be about the things that really matter and not about attacking or tearing down individuals in a way that, one, provides media fodder and distraction from the truly complex challenges that we actually face, and 2, that would be unacceptable in any other contemporary workplace. But the institution of politics and the system of it is very resilient. That's why, off the back of the federal Jenkins report and the Broderick report in New South Wales Parliament, and I think most parliaments in Australia have had some kind of review into toxic workplace cultures, we worked with 4 women MPs, 1 Labor, 1 Liberal, 1 Green, and 1 Independent to create this initiative. We now have over 30% of women in New South Wales Parliament as alumni of this program, women from right across the political spectrum, working together to transform New South Wales Parliament for the participation and flourishing of women and of everyone. And this year, we actually expanded the program nationwide, bringing women together across all 3 levels of Parliament. So we meet with these women after the initial program at regular intervals and provide a safe space and process for them to work on the prototypes that they've co-designed, which are various ways to transform Parliament. But most importantly, their relationships have been transformed. And that's already had an incredible effect on the experience of Parliament for women. So this is a highly ideologically divided community with often competing priorities coming together to constructively discuss and make progress on a collective purpose. In my initial meetings with these women, I explained the program as transforming self to transform system. So the belief that we can transform systems one conversation at a time. So back to the areas of guidance and applying them to this work. The first area of guidance is modeling open and curious conversations. This requires curiosity. In our work with MPs, we focus on sharing and exploring our values and the beliefs that we attach to those values as a way to open up curious conversation. We have to find ways to understand the experiences of others. We have so many participants who comment on how after the course, They now see the people they previously regarded as enemies as humans, and humans that they deeply understand. And this sets an entirely new basis for the way they interact, even when they are in strong opposition about something ideological or policy-based. The second area of guidance is forging connections before conclusions. This requires compassion. In our programs, we ensure a psychologically safe container. So out of a 2-day workshop, we spend at least half a day co-creating agreements, role modeling vulnerability, and establishing a safe space. And it's about listening, learning, and creating a generative space for something new to emerge. And so much of that requires trust to be established. The third area of guidance is practice reflexive thought. This requires courage. In our programs, we introduce the skill of being on the balcony and in the dance. And this is essentially practicing reflexivity. So being part of the action, or in this case, the conversation, and being able to consider curiously the experience and motivations driving the person you're conversing with, and then considering the same of yourself. So what assumptions are you both bringing to the conversation? It's not about getting people to discuss things on our terms, but about purposefully and intentionally guiding and refocusing the conversation to unpack what it is the other person is trying to communicate. And last area of guidance is fostering genuine exchanges, deflecting divisive tactics. In our programs, we use tools like the 4 levels of listening and speaking, which we'll share with you in a moment. And this has helped us set up the enabling conditions for genuine exchange. So you know the old adage, listening isn't thinking about what you will say next. It's about being conscious of the intention you bring to the conversation. It's a self-awareness and self-management. How do you ensure you step out of your reactive mind and into your creative mind? So reflecting on the guidance and what we heard from the research participants, to truly become better at constructive discussion, it should be less about coping with or through conversations and more about leading. If you genuinely want to enable conditions for constructive discussion, one that leaves room for emergence and possibility, then we need to get better at these 4 things. And it's like any other skill, it requires intentionality and practice. This is just a muscle that needs to be exercised. And with that, I'm going to pass to Laura to talk more about our work with UTS and what's happening next. Thanks, Laura.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chloe. And just going to check quickly that I'm sharing screen. Cool, I'm getting a smile. So I think we're good to go. Great. So incredibly excited to be part of this team. And there are a whole lot of things that really unite the work that we're doing. And so the Next25 and the UTS Transdisciplinary School partnership really brings together an emphasis on systems thinking, transdisciplinary approaches, commitment to a real-world impact. And also, as I hope you'll see from the insights that I share about our collaboration so far, the organizations also hold a real commitment and conviction born of experience that if we're going to actually find the solutions that we need to be recognizing and amplifying the expertise that we're really surrounded by. And this includes expertise that you have as folks who are listening today as well. So this means we need to be really working with a really broad range of people to try to understand what it is that constructive discussion might look like in the world and to help us really maximize this lever for actually improving our democracy. So our very first collaboration focused on beginning to identify and really categorize the range of interventions that were supporting constructive discussion. And you can see a whole list of them here. And we wanted to bring those together in the hopes of generating a framework that could be a living resource for practitioners and researchers of constructive discussion. So we held an initial workshop that brought together knowledge from transdisciplinary researchers at UTS with members of the Next25 team to share knowledge about methods of actually holding constructive discussions. And through doing so, we found that while a number of these approaches operated at different spheres and different scales, they tended to operate in particular ways and in particular aspects of life, so from the personal up to the cultural. And we've come to conceive of these scales as being spheres that have a concentric relationship, with each affecting the other. So, for example, our cultures are really shape our institutions, but also those institutions play a really important role in forming our broader culture. And so, to briefly go through the kinds of approaches contained in these spheres, the personal here at the very centre includes many of those individual skills that Chloë was just speaking about. So things like, building tolerance for diverse perspectives, developing empathy, or also increasing media literacy. The next sphere captures those interventions that really support conversations between individuals and within small groups. So examples of this include the circle structures, Indigenous yarning, or frameworks like nonviolent communication. This sphere also includes the kinds of practices that meeting and workshop facilitators often incorporate into their work to try to really foster trust and the possibility of transformation. Out to the next sphere that we've identified, we have the institutional, which and actions there around constructive discussion tend to want to transform established institutional structures, such as parliaments and their associated bureaucracies, but also media and education institutions to try to really help people to better connect and do good work together. So examples of this include things like very structured, deliberative processes, such as citizens' juries, which are designed to broaden out participatory structures in democracy, or processes that are designed to expand the ways that members of an institution might frame or approach issues. So things like participatory futuring processes. And finally, we identified an even more expansive cultural sphere of interventions, where the aim was to shift cultural imaginaries and also discourses, narratives, and all of those things that can either hinder or help constructive discussion. So while this cultural level can be harder to shift, these interventions can and do target this level of action. And so one tangible example is the publication of refugee stories by the Refugee Council of Australia. And that work really wanted to combat polarizing narratives and dehumanizing narratives. So it is possible to also bring around change on that level as well. Now, we found that this framework really offers a tool for mapping the kinds of interventions that might be useful, depending on where we identify the particular block to constructive discussion. So, for example, if we find that breakdown seems to be happening at a conversational level, what models might we use? And you can see here there's a whole lot of different models that we've identified that can be used depending on where we identify those problems. The framework is also a really valuable way of checking that we've considered diverse options for improving constructive discussion, and it gives us the chance to also combine interventions. So, for example, if we were going to hold, say, a citizens' assembly, so one form of deliberative democracy, we might be able to improve that by giving people some skills around the personal and the conversational before they arrive. So maybe we'd do an empathy exercise with them. Or on the cultural level, and our wonderful collaborator, Annika Bassett, who's from the Centre for Public Impact, has recently published a really great piece that I'd strongly recommend. It's with the ABC called Dancing with Democracy. And in that, she's thinking with Lakoff and Johnson about how it is that metaphors that equate argument with war subtly shift the way that we approach disagreement and difference, and on that cultural level. So if we were going to act on that cultural level and follow their suggestions to actually help to shift this potential cultural barrier to constructive discussion, in this imagined citizens' assembly, we might want to encourage people to really imagine argument and discussion as being a dance instead of a battle. And as we'll return to, this approach of combining aspects of interventions for maximum effectiveness is something that our emerging research is really seeking to trial and evaluate, and to make more broadly available as well. And now this next piece of work is, I just want to note now, it's almost published, which is very exciting, and it's been led by Dr. Sam Woon. So if you're interested in this, please do get in touch, and we should have announcements shortly about it being published. And in this piece of work, we were really diving into our ultimate objective in exploring constructive discussion, which is to find practical ways to intervene and foster and strengthen constructive discussion. So what we did here is that we looked at constructive discussion through the prism of the Sydney Housing Challenge to help us to understand where constructive discussion might actually be of use. And so we had mapped out the various actors who actually play a role in bringing about the future, and this was work that Next25 had previously done. And using that as a heuristic, we sampled people from all of those different spheres and also made sure that we covered the full spectrum of people's opinions and views about housing. And we found that asking people in these interviews about where constructive discussion was breaking down was incredibly useful as a diagnostic tool. And as you can see, we've got a really complex system here. But in these conversations, people were able to home in on things like, there was a difficulty in terms of there being a lack of purpose. So people often disagreed, is housing about, and a housing conversation is about having shelter, or is it about investment? People also noted that another challenge was up on that discourse, so that cultural level, that really that there was a mood in which people were thinking about housing just as an asset. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to be thinking about it in that way, but it did mean that certain other experiences were being shut out and were really difficult to talk about. They also noted that in many different realms, so this was in conversations about zoning, but also development approvals and media and in national conversations as well, there was just a lack of tools and ability to actually hold constructive discussion. And people also found that it was difficult even to get involved and speak with various levels of government. And finally, also that we didn't have those broader overarching narratives that really reflected people's experiences now. And so our takeaway from this really first attempt to be using this framework in the real world was that it was incredibly clarifying of helping us to approach, as you can see here in this diagram, a very messy, complex system. That was really helpful for us to actually be able to home in on where are some possible places that we can intervene, and help to make a difference for Australia's ability to actually have the kind of democracy that we want. And I'd like to just take a moment now to have a pause. And I'll come back to speaking about the research that we're going to do. But one of the amazing things about doing this work is that we also find things that help for personal life as well as on that broader cultural and political level. And of course, all of those spheres are always interconnected. So I'd love to give you a few takeaways in the forms of some maybe uncomfortable questions that summarize our findings so far after 5 years of looking into constructive discussion. But before I do that, I'd just like to offer some resources for thinking about constructive discussion. And so it's really important, I think, that we don't get into blaming ourselves when we're not doing our very best, and instead to think about the kinds of resources that might help us to turn up in the ways that we'd love to. So these might be things like, what environments or contexts help you the most? Do you do best when you're out walking with people or if you're in nature? And there are studies about all of these things, including even that driving together and looking the same way can be helpful to have the conversations that you need to. And are you well resourced in other ways? All of those everyday things like food and sleep, but also maybe there are particular practices that you have that actually help you to get into that state. And then with those resources in mind, some of the questions that emerged from our research that I'd love to just prod you with are things like, when you go into these situations, are you willing and open to feel discomfort? What kind of stories are you telling yourself about people? And are you able to maybe get curious about what's going on for others? Are you willing, as Chloe mentioned earlier, to put connections before conclusions and actually meet people as fellow humans first before you start getting into the weeds about the particular discussion you might need to have? And also, how are you framing your interactions? And if you find that you're thinking of it as a war, might it be possible to follow what Annika Bassett notes and actually shift into maybe being a dance instead? And I love this one. What am I also doing? So you might think, oh, consciously, on some level, I'm here for constructive discussion. But actually, if I'm really honest, maybe I'm also trying to make the other person feel small or to prove something about myself. And if you find yourself in that mode, is it possible to acknowledge it, forgive yourself, and then think about who you might want to be now? And also for the sixth point, is it possible, if you've got a certain thing you tend to hold on to, might it be possible to put that aside just for now? Doesn't mean you're abandoning that important point, but it might just allow for something more generative to come back in the present. And finally, how is it that you're critically engaging with both old and new media? And we can end up getting stuck, of course, in echo chambers. I think it happens to all of us. And they can feel kind of comforting sometimes. So is it possible just to maybe stretch outside of that and find out what else might be going on in the world? So as we're looking forward to what next in terms of our research, we've got really three key focuses at the moment, a whole lot more to come, but just for now, what we're focusing on is, can we really break down constructive discussion to look at the particular elements that come together? And the reason that we're doing that is that then also helps us to be able to make more nuanced approaches. So if we can say in nonviolent communication, if we identify the particular strategy that might work, say using an I statement rather than a you statement, that gives us a little nugget that we can maybe add more easily into other interventions rather than trying to force entire programs together, which doesn't always work. The second part is, can we actually help to identify those skills that experts have that they're not always aware of? And there are a lot of people who are great at really generating the kinds of generosity that constructive discussion needs, but those experts aren't always wonderful at telling you why what they're doing works or even what it is that they're doing. And this is just a thing that happens with expertise, and you'll probably know it with the things that you're best at. It's kind of hard sometimes to say what you're doing. So we're going to be doing some very close observation with people who are great at this to try to understand what really works. And finally, we're going to really be looking at what happens in the world in context. And one of the things that Chloe noted, so we know in the science really follows this, that by creating a safe place and having a great facilitator, transformations really do happen. But what happens out in the world? And what kinds of combinations of actions and spaces might most support constructive discussion? So that will be the third element that we're going to be looking at. And at that, I'm going to pass us back to the wonderful Chloe.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks also to the Next25 team for all the work to make this webinar possible. We're really proud to contribute to the Australian Festival of Democracy and Human Rights and to share our experience and perspectives on how constructive discussion can play a role across many levels in restoring trust in government and building a resilient democracy. I do have more to share, but just so there is time before the webinar closes, we've popped a link into the chat function that will take you all to a short evaluation survey, or you can use the QR code that's there on the slide. It's just a couple of very short multiple choice questions on one open text box. We really value, appreciate, and need your feedback. So if you could click on that and open it up, and you can come back to it when the webinar's finished, we'd really love to hear your thoughts. So now I just want you to cast your mind back to that social scenario or work lunch or family barbecue, whatever it was that you imagined at the start of the webinar. That moment when you encountered a difficult conversation and you felt uncomfortable contributing in the way that you would like to. Do you feel that you've learnt something today, a new tool or a skill that might have changed how you conversed in that moment? And we've got the list up again of some of the questions that you might ask yourself to help with that. Have you heard something today that you could put into immediate use? If I cast my mind back to my scenario, my fiery family dinner debates, the one that jumps out at me is, am I trying to prove something about myself? And if I'm honest, I may have been trying to discuss something constructively, but I may also have been trying to prove just how smart I was. And I imagine that was going on for a few people in my family conversations. So they're really useful questions, if a little bit humbling to consider when we're thinking about how we interact. So have a look. Let us know if any of them jump out at you or you think that you might be able to use one in the near future. If you do put one into action in the next week or months, we'd love to hear about it. Please get in touch and let us know. After today, Next25 will email all attendees a copy of this recording, along with links to the relevant research and programs discussed, and we'll ask you to let us know if you're interested in being involved in next steps with us. As I explained, all the work we've done to date is about collaborating with stakeholders across the system. It's a fundamental practice for us and the success of what we're trying to achieve. So with that, thank you for joining. Thank you for your time and thank you for your interest. Goodbye.